Hey everybody, Simon Rosenberg, Hopium Chronicles. We're here for another discussion with a thought leader, elected official, people who are driving our understanding of this moment that we're in. And joining me today is Michel, a guy whose work I have followed very closely and I've learned a whole lot from over time. Casey, welcome to
Thanks so
Hopium.
much, Simon. Likewise, learned a lot from you. So happy to have this conversation today.
So welcome. Listen, you're a journalist, you're an author, you are trying to help people in America understand about money laundering and kleptocracy. It's a big, crazy word, kleptocracy, right? Can you just walk us through a little bit about what you spend your time researching and communicating about?
Yeah, absolutely. Day to day, month by month, year by year, almost decade by decade now, I do most of my work researching and investigating how it is that international money laundering operations work and what the nexus of dirty money influence campaigns, dirty money networks, and financial secrecy vehicles, how that intersects with politics, how that helps dictators around the world, and how it helps degrade democracy, including right here in the United States of America. I mean, the word kleptocracy literally means rule of thieves, those that are in power in country after country, regime after regime around the world that are dedicated not to good governance, not even necessarily to what their constituents want, but are dedicated only to remaining in power as long as they can and grabbing as many levers of wealth, as much access to as much money from the public purse as possible, keeping it, hiding it, laundering it, making sure we can never track and trace it so that they can get rich, their friends can get rich, their families can get rich, and they can stay in power for as long as they want.
So given that that's what you have focused on, and we know that Donald Trump's good friend, as according to the ODNI, described Putin as Donald Trump's good friend, is sort of the king of the kleptocrats, in terms of having dismembered a state and stolen enormous Russian wealth. Reflect on what you're seeing in these early days of the new Trump regime.
I don't think it's any surprise. And frankly, it should have gotten far more headlines and far more attention than it has. But I don't think it's any surprise that one of the very first things that Donald Trump did in his new administration, it wasn't just targeting immigrants, it wasn't just ignoring court orders, it wasn't even just the kind of geopolitical decisions and back channel conversations he's been having with Vladimir Putin, and I'm sure plenty of other dictators around the world. One of the very first things he and his administration did was demolish almost all of the remaining anti-corruption legislation and policies that we have here in the United States of America. I mean, it's no stretch, and I've written about this elsewhere. The last 6 weeks, last 8 weeks or so have been the single worst stretch in all of American history as it pertains to anti-corruption policy. You can go back to things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was passed in 1977. This is the bedrock statute that makes it illegal for American companies to bribe foreign governments, foreign officials, foreign dictators. Makes that illegal. It set the precedent for other countries for decades. And here comes Donald Trump saying in an executive order, he's not going to enforce it. He says it's a horrible law. And this has happened in pillar after pillar after pillar of the U.S.'s anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy policy. I mean, we don't have a lot of time today, Simon, so I don't need to go through the whole laundry list of things, but this has been the single worst period in American history for anti-corruption and counter-kleptocracy policy. And who is benefiting? It is the crooked. It is the corrupt. It is the kleptocratic, the oligarchs abroad and the oligarchs right here in the United States of America. And of course, those dictators that are on top of politics in places like Russia and increasingly around the world as well. This is a pattern that we have seen play out, whether in Hungary, whether in Turkey, whether in Azerbaijan, and of course in Russia as well. And unfortunately, we're seeing similar dynamics right here in the US.
One of the most, in addition to the sort of self-enrichment that Trump has pursued with his cryptocurrency and his marketing and all that kind of more kind of familiar and pedestrian kind of stuff. One of the things that I have been really struck by in all of this is Musk, right? And that Musk has come in with this mantle of being a reformer to make government work more efficiently, right? And to do the right thing for the American taxpayer. And we know that in his efforts, they've not only are destroying our entire scientific research infrastructure in the United States, and illegally and unconstitutionally evaporating entire government agencies and departments. But it certainly looks like he's made a decision that he's just going to start grabbing a lot of stuff. And, that begins with him setting up, potentially him putting a back door into the Treasury payment system, which raises all sorts of unbelievable issues about the control of our money, the Treasury, right? We know now that he's making a huge play to become the provider for the aviation security system, right? The air traffic control system in the United States. He's now making a big play to take the money from the rural broadband initiative. We're talking about tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars that Musk appears to have decided that he's going to give to himself as part of the payment for all the wreckage and the wrecking ball that he's been. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know if you've written about this or engaged in this, but share your thoughts about the early days of Elon Musk here.
On the one hand, this is a very American story, certainly modern American story of deep-pocketed donors supporting an administration, of course, Donald Trump being the ultimate example of it, and targeting the regulators that have any kind of say, any kind of caps on what these companies or these individuals can do. Again, this is a story we have seen going back decades, but this is not only quantitatively, but qualitatively different. We have never seen a figure like Elon Musk, who effectively bought a president, right? His entrance into the 2024 campaign was one of, if not the key dynamics that helped launch or relaunch Donald Trump back to the presidency. And now Elon Musk is reaping the fruits of all those hundreds of millions of dollars that he spent on Donald Trump's campaign. He is acting, frankly, like the president himself. Of course, Trump still has the title and is acting in all kinds of bad faith, or at least pro-Trump interests. But Musk is acting in a way we have never, ever seen before in U.S. history. And frankly, this goes back to a concern that the founders themselves had about the ultra-rich, the ultra-wealthy. I'm sure they never imagined a figure like Musk himself effectively taking over American politics and using their resources for the benefit only of themselves. And of course, this gets back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, about modern corruption, modern money laundering, modern kleptocracy, and the benefits that accrue to those who are in power, those deep-pocketed oligarchic figures. Simon, I should also shamelessly plug that I just signed a new book contract for my next book. It's called
Please.
The United States of Oligarchy. Needless to say, Elon Musk will be playing a role. It's currently scheduled to be released sometime next year, but plenty of material to write about and certainly plenty of material to watch for in the coming weeks, months, and years.
So as we see that Trump dismantled what had been significant investment by the Biden administration to modernize our anti-kleptocracy regime, right? This was an area of, in some ways, as somebody who really has been in this Russia battle and the dirty money wars here in the US, I was really proud of the Biden administration, and they may have started a little bit slow, but the gains they made in the last few years to really ratchet this up as a global project was really important. Trump has come in and vaporized and gotten rid of all that. What is reasonable, given your experience in other countries? What is reasonable for us to expect now here over the next few years, in the way that Trump is acting lawlessly outside of the Constitution, is now at a point where he believes that he has unchecked power and that he's already violating all sorts of the most de minimis kind of ethical and legal guidelines for politicians in the United States, and as if it doesn't matter, right? I mean, what should we expect out of, we know that Jared Kushner, for example, is already doing deals with Russian-friendly, countries in the in Europe. What happens next?
Yeah, Simon, look, I don't necessarily know that I'm going to be telling you a lot that you and your listeners haven't heard already. It's going to be further pressure on independent investigative bodies. It's going to be further pressure on media and especially media ownership groups. I think looking at the case of Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post and how the Post has already clearly begun pulling its punches regarding the administration. It's simply going to be targeting any and all who can provide any kind of checks or balances to the current administration itself, whether that is ignoring court orders, whether that is launching clearly politically motivated prosecutions, taking us back to the days of Richard Nixon, if not significantly before that. I mean, this is going to be considered, I have no doubt, one of the darkest chapters of American authoritarianism. I'm still ultimately optimistic in the long run, but of course, there are plenty of steps down a far darker path that I do think are ahead of us. And it is a matter of making sure that those who still have some say in how the governance of this country is run, those local representatives, those members of Congress, even independent journalists and academics and analysts themselves are supported, are amplified, because those are going to be the ones that are next on the chopping block. Those are going to be the ones that are targeted, just as we have seen play out in the Russias and the Turkeys and the Azerbaijans and the Chinas, and the list goes on and on and on, of these authoritarian, dictatorial, and especially kleptocratic regimes that are, again, dedicated to nothing more than remaining in power and enriching themselves and their family members as much as possible. And I should say, I'm glad that you did mention Jared Kushner, because he is also going to be one of the key figures in my new book. But I do think he's been severely overlooked and underappreciated as a case study in how it's not just these American figures operating in a vacuum, but they are networking. They are learning from and looking to for inspiration other governments and other regimes in Hungary, in Saudi Arabia, in Serbia, United Arab Emirates. Kushner is leading the way, but he is far from alone. And that is what we have in store for us moving forward.
I think what you just raised is really important, because as I have, been involved in the domestic side of Russia's penetration of the Republican Party and their attack on the Democratic Party back in 2016, I try to remind everybody that Trump is now openly not only working with a genocidal uh, leader in Putin and abandoning our European and Western allies, but he's also now aligning himself with a political leader who attacked the Democratic Party and our nominee in 2016, and which ignoring this or encouraging, this kind of behavior. And I think the thing that I think about a lot with what's going to happen or what's happened is that I really do believe that I don't think Trump is all that smart a guy. I think that he was kind of a one trick pony guy for a lot of his career. He had assets and so on. He played them. He was clearly set up some of his properties as pure money laundering vehicles. I mean, my favorite is the Panama story, right? Which is that building that he had in Panama that was completely empty because they basically sold all the apartments to drug dealers and illicit folks from all and Russians and all sorts of people. It's an amazing story. But I've always believed that Trump has become expert at being a kleptocrat and a wannabe dictator. And I've been just convinced that he's had a coach through this whole thing, which has been Putin. They did a 2.5 hour phone call today, right? Which is, what in the world could they be talking about for 2.5 hours, right? And who knows how many calls that they had and how many intermediaries came to visit Trump, where Trump was being taught by them how to become who he is, because he's learned really quickly. And, because there's a lot of things that he's not so good at, and your point about how Americans now, our American oligarchs, have been, Elon Musk, as another example, has spent more money and more time with the Russian government and the Chinese government than virtually any other American alive. And so they've had these opportunities to learn from Orban, from Putin, from others who have initiated kleptocratic regimes. And the truth is, this is the big one, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to seize the assets of a country and the money and control, America is the big one, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
are the wealthiest country in the world. And it's why that Elon went after the treasury payment systems
Mhm.
as one of the very first things that he did, right?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
wasn't something that came at the end of his time.
Yeah.
It was certain things that happened in the early days, as if the entire project, that the cutting and the efficiency was all sort of a smokescreen for them, starting to do what Russia did after the Cold War ended, where a bunch of oligarchs came in and basically divvied up the assets of the regime among a handful of people, privatized them, put their brothers and sisters on boards of all the companies, their kids and everything else. it, Elon's Doge looks like it is an accelerant for that whole process to happen in the United States.
Yeah, and of course, this didn't begin with Elon. This goes back years. Of course, Simon, as you and I were talking about off mic, you are as steeped in so many of these networks and so many of these revelations and so many of these concerns as anyone. And I think back 10, 11 years ago when I first started covering some of these topics. Before 2016, I was fresh out of graduate school. I had no money to my name. Very few editors were interested in what these Russian influence and interference networks were doing. Here we are 10, 11, 12 years later. I certainly wish we'd been a little more awake at the wheel rather than asleep as we were. But again, we have never seen a figure like Musk, this kind of singular oligarchic vector for not only all the rank white collar corruption, grand corruption, and of course, seizures of power, or at least access to all the information that Americans have with the federal government, but of also a kind of go between, an intermediary that I'm sure Vladimir Putin and plenty of other oligarchic and dictatorial forces around the world couldn't possibly have dreamed of. I mean, there was an article the other day that I was reading talking about how the last few weeks have really been more than Putin could have ever possibly wished for, especially given where things were just a few months ago. And Musk has now become the biggest bullhorn, the biggest proponent of rank Russian propaganda. And it's absolutely devastating to American national interests, American security interests, of course, American alliances, and of course, Ukraine itself. And I don't know where it's going to end, but I do have a sense things are going to have to get worse before they eventually do get better.
Yeah, I mean, one positive in all of this is that Musk's approval ratings in polling in the last 10 days have
Mm-hmm.
really cratered.
Yeah.
And in addition to his stock price and to the rockets continuing to explode and the wild overreach and laying off hundreds of thousands of Americans and continually getting beat in court, there is Musk is clearly unsettled
Yeah.
by how unpopular he's become,
Yeah.
and at least in a democracy, that kind of stuff still really matters, for their currency and their ability to navigate. And, while we are still hanging on to by our fingernails to be something that resembles a democracy. And I think we're running out of time. Casey, do you have any other just final things that we didn't cover or anything you want to, I want to say to the Hopium audience that I'm introducing Casey as sort of a character today, as a friend of Hopium that we're going to bring back because I still haven't totally gotten my head around all the things that he writes about. I read everything he writes. We're in a moment where this issue of oligarchical kleptocratic behavior is now so central to everything that's happening. And we did a poor job. Our
Yeah.
country and our political leaders did a terrible job over the last 10 years sensitizing the public to what the Russian mafia state, how it operated, and the fact that it had deeply penetrated one of our two political parties in the United States. And it was never something that was a major part of the election or part of our discussions, in all of this. And I think we paid a price, to your point. But Casey, just final thoughts. I mean, is there anything that I haven't covered today that you want to get out there?
Look, no, Simon, I think there's, God knows we could talk for hours or days about some of these topics. I think the kind of the last point that I do want to just to make, which I'm going to try to do more of on my end moving forward, is that, I have certainly used plenty of times we've been using today terms like kleptocracy, terms like oligarchy, which of course are perfectly fine to use. And I try in some of my writing to kind of break down what those terms are and why they should be used to describe what we're living through right now. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is corruption on an almost unimaginable scale and a sense of unfairness that I think has seeped in across the United States of America on both sides of the political spectrum. Of course, they have different voting outcomes. But I do think if there is a silver lining, if there is an opening, you just mentioned Musk's declining, maybe even plummeting approval ratings. We're already seeing indications of that with Donald Trump himself. And what
Yep.
Trump and Musk are doing is opening themselves up, really shoving in our faces the reality that this is a smash grab by a group of ultra wealthy billionaires that have no allegiance to any country, no allegiance necessarily to even any political party, that are enriching themselves at the expense of everything else that we hold dear, whether it is Social Security, whether it is our 401ks, whether it is a stable American economy itself. That is something that I think everyone can access. So, yes, I will continue talking about kleptocracy and oligarchy, but I do think as the days and the weeks and the months still come, people are going to see more and more and more of this clear as day evidence of massive corruption. It's going to be in their face, it's going to be impossible to miss. And who knows? Maybe that'll even be the way out of this current predicament that we find ourselves in.
Well, and it ties into, just to finish, I mean, it ties into that part of the smash and grab is what they're trying to do with our tax and economic policy, right? That they are literally, inflation's rising. Hey, no biggie, right? Because rich people, it doesn't affect rich people. The rest of you guys, tough shit for a little while. You're going to have to eat it, right? And then the coming, budget that Trump is pushing, which is going to dramatically cut taxes on wealthy people, and the most privileged, while taking weakening healthcare for 80 million Americans
Mhm.
and exploding the deficit, right,
Yeah.
to huge amounts. I mean, in a way, by the way, that we know will not benefit the American economy or help growth or deal with inflation, right? In fact, it doesn't address any of that stuff. And so I do think that what you're seeing in the Democratic language right now, that they're clearly seeing in the polling, is this positioning of Trump and Musk as smash and grab billionaires, right?
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
that we are still in the early days of telling this story, but we know from polling that there is this belief that there is deep corruption in American politics. And we're going to have to, and that people hate it, by the way. I mean, particularly independent voters are the most sensitive around issues around corruption in Washington. And, Biden and Kamala Harris had no agenda for that in public. Trump ran as the guy who was anti Washington to clean it up. But I think we have an enormous amount of running room here politically. And Casey, I'm going to dive more into your work. What's the name of your book, by the way, your latest book? Can you tell everybody?
The first one is called American Kleptocracy, about the U.S.'s central role in global offshore finance. And the new one, a few months ago, is called Foreign Agents, about how American foreign lobbyists act as middlemen for dictators around the world, including in the highest ranks of American politics itself. And then the next one will be the United States of Oligarchy, which I'm sure I'll be talking plenty about in the months to come.
Casey, you're doing amazing work. Welcome to Hopium. Hopefully, we'll have you back. I will start including anything you want me to include in my daily posts. Please send to me. I'll get it out to folks. And just really grateful for your incredible courage and grit and determination in dealing with what are tough issues against bad guys. And so, thank you for all that you're doing.
Thanks. Absolutely, Simon. Very happy to be here and looking forward to joining you again soon.
Okay, brother. Thanks, everyone.